Welcome to Practice D&E, the podcast that teaches you how to set up, build and run your own practice. Sponsored by Icon practice management software, get anywhere access to your system while saving thousands in upfront costs. Visit iconpractice.com now.
Hi there, I'm Matthew Holmes and I'm your host on Practice D&A, the podcast where we teach you how to set up, build and run your own practice. This is obviously our first episode and I'd just like to give you a bit of background information about who the show's for, etc. I'm a chiropractor, but this show is also for acupuncturists, myotherapists, osteopaths, physiotherapists, a lot of people that would be classified as allied health, also practitioners such as naturopaths, etc. So even though I'm coming from a chiropractic perspective, I'd like to think that we've got some useful information here that a lot of people that are going to actually be able to benefit from. The show's sort of really targeted at those who are new graduates and people who are looking at starting a practice particularly, but I'm sure that those who are already running a practice will also get something from it as well. Now, my experience is this. I've been in practice for almost 18 years and I've practiced in multidisciplinary practices where we had osteopaths, other chiropractors, acupuncturists, traditional Chinese herbalists, etc., all sorts of different practitioners, and that was a great experience. I've also worked alongside a lot of GPs and so on also, so I'm hoping that I can bring to you a great selection of possible practice options. I've also owned single and multi-doctor practices, so I'm bringing that sort of experience to the table as well. Now, obviously, we just need to clarify that this show is not a replacement for professional advice. Now, obviously, I'm not a lawyer or an accountant, and everything that comes up in this show is just my opinion and is based on my experience. So if you're in any doubt, you really should be getting your own professional advice. I'm an Australian. I'm practicing here in Australia. I've also practiced in the United Kingdom for quite a while. But this show is mainly tapered for Australian audiences. However, those who are overseas will probably benefit from it as well, particularly those in the UK, because there is quite a lot of overlap between the two. But I imagine places like New Zealand, Singapore, etc. will probably also benefit as well. But if you are listening somewhere else, you definitely should be getting some local advice before taking any action based on the information in the podcast. In future shows, we're going to look at things like business structures, whether you should be a sole trader, partnership or a company. We're going to be looking at things like funding models for starting your practice, how to buy a practice, how to value your practice or to value a practice that you may be looking at purchasing. We're going to look at things like hiring staff and also very important topics like communicating with staff and patients as well. However, today we're going to start by looking at employed versus self-employed, both from the perspective of the employee and for those who are looking at employing an associate. Now, for a lot of practitioners, particularly those running your practice, self-employed does seem to be the way that most people want to go. However, it's not always guaranteed that that's really going to be the best approach for you, because there's several pros and cons to each position. And you need to make sure that it is appropriate for your situation and for your aims and your goals within practice. Now, if you're an employee and you're looking at being employed, there's several benefits for that. Now, the first benefit is which is that you're getting pretty much a guaranteed salary, or at very least a baseline guaranteed salary, and then you'll often be paid a commission on top of that. And you're also getting such things as paid holidays, public holidays, sick pay, etc. You're also likely to be getting a superannuation or pension for those who are not in Australia. And generally, if you're going to be employed by somebody, they're quite often going to be giving you an established patient base. Because they've got various costs associated with employing you, like those we just outlined, things like holiday and sick pay and all that type of stuff. They need to make sure that there's going to be enough patients there for you to treat in the first place, that they're going to get enough money back in to cover the cost of you being in the practice. So if you're coming in and getting a job in these places, that's often one of the main benefits of being an employee. The negatives of being an employee are that you generally get less paid to you up front because, quite often if you're coming in from a self-employed position, you'll get paid a higher percentage of what you earn. And the reason for that is because your employer has a lot of overheads. They've got to pay your holiday, they've got to pay your sick pay, they've got to pay pension or superannuation contributions, things like the sick pay that we mentioned earlier. And if that all has to be taken into account, and they obviously can't be paying you as much as if you weren't getting those benefits. There's also the thing that you're likely to be getting less tax benefits if you are going as an employee. If you're self-employed, running your own business, in Australia you need to get an ABN for that, which is like effectively a tax number for your business. You can claim a lot of extra things on your tax. You can put a lot more things like your mobile phone. You can claim your office and so on at home, a lot of which isn't available to you when you're an employee. Now, obviously, you need to really talk to your accountant and see what sort of things they suggest and what you can get away with and not. However, as a general rule, you're going to get more tax perks if you're a self-employed person. The other downside is that your tax is usually taken out of your pay before you actually get any of it paid to you. Now, that is a bit of a downside because when you're self-employed, your tax is only paid quarterly or at the end of the year, and so you get to pay out your any of your costs before that, and so you can wipe your costs off first of all before you pay your tax, as opposed to if you're an employer, you pay the tax up front, and then if you're lucky you can claim it back afterwards. Now, if you're an employer, why on earth would you want to actually employ somebody? Because generally, from an employer's point of view, you're going to be looking that somebody's better value for you or better to be employed by you if they're actually self-employed. From a tax perspective, there is less risk in employing somebody. One of the major downsides can be that if you haven't set things up properly, the tax office can come back to you and say, look, this person that you've said all along is self-employed. We don't actually think they are. We think they're an employee, and therefore we'd like you to pay us X amount of dollars in tax or pounds or whatever country you're in. Now, generally the way it works is that you're not allowed to go after the employee for any money that they should have paid in tax. So in effect, you've paid out all this money to your contractor if they've been a self-employed person, and then now the tax office is saying that you've got to pay all this extra money in addition to what you've already paid. Whereas if somebody is is an employee up front, you don't have that risk. It's less of a problem because usually, you're obviously taking tax out as things are going along. You're paying your superannuation contributions, and so there's no debate about that point. There's also the possibility that employee types, people who are willing to come on board as an employee, are possibly more willing to stay in your organisation for longer. Now, given that it's going to take you some time to train your employees up, bring them up to speed with your office procedures and practices and so forth, and how you'd like things done in your clinic and so on, that is an investment of your time and of your money and so forth. And if your employees are clearing off, your practitioners are clearing off all the time, it's going to cost you quite a lot to have to retrain somebody, reorientate somebody into your practice. And eventually that can become quite a drain on your resources. So if you can employ somebody up front who is good, but who is perhaps more inclined to want to be an employee rather than actually going off and setting up their own practice, that's got to be better for you in the longer term. So there's a potential benefit there as well. The negatives for an employer, most people who are running their practice will probably be aware of this already if they've got staff, is that your costs are quite a bit higher if you're employing somebody versus self-employed, because you have all those things like the paid holiday and the sick pay and the public holidays and superannuation contributions, pension contributions, etc., which you won't have if the person is self-employed.